Surviving the Survivor.
Welcome back, STS Nation, for another episode of Surviving the Survivor. Once again, Carm is not here in person, but she is always looking over my shoulder. Another phenomenal panel of guests today. We have Dr. Brian Wolf, the professor, the Ph.D., and he comes from where else but the University of Idaho, where he is the chair of the Department of Culture, Society, and Justice, as I said, at UI, the University of Idaho, where these heinous murders took place and where he currently teaches criminology and deviant behavior, something that has sadly affected the university in a major, major way. And below him is Dr. Debbie Goodman of St. Thomas University, close to where I am here in Miami in South Florida. She is a criminologist, a published author, educator, and former TV show host. So welcome to one and all. A quick programming note, Patreon. It's a tough thing to put on as many shows as we're doing. We'd appreciate support, love your support. You get some ad-free content as well as BTS, or behind the scenes footage. And we're happy to announce we have our first live virtual meet and greet with myself and Carmela, the star of the show, who's a Holocaust survivor. You can ask her questions about that, questions about true crime. That will take place January 5th at 8 p.m. for our Patreon supporters. I like to start off each show with the names of the victims because sometimes the victims get lost in all of this. So let us never forget the young lives lost way too soon. Madison Mogen, 21, Kaylee Goncalves, 21, Xana Kernodle, 20, and Ethan Chapin. And right off to you, Dr. Brian Wolf, the professor at the University of Idaho. Our condolences, of course, go out to the entire community and to you. How are you personally doing right now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, whenever we have a lot, I mean, we talk about our university community as a family, and you know, even if you don't directly know somebody, it is really hard. But just given the gruesomeness of this act, I mean, our community doesn't have this kind of thing. We obviously we don't have national news parachuting in for these types of stories. So it's been difficult. We've had students that have been begging me to have class and to give some semblance of normality on this campus, and others they left home before Thanksgiving and they've not come back. And so we've had a couple vigils. Last night we had our annual Christmas tree lighting in the community, and that was much to honor the victims and to kind of collectively mourn as a community. Yeah.
And what percentage would you say of your students did not return after the Thanksgiving break?
Oh, that's a good question. On one hand, when something like this happens, you want to be accommodating. So I just throw everything on Zoom and you know, and then say I have class. And there's a chunk of students that the second you turn on Zoom, they just don't show up, and they'll just stream it from the dorm room because they don't want to put whatever pants on or whatever. And you know, but I had I was in class. I was having, I'd say about 20% of my students were in class and that was about it. It's always kind of hard to get them back from Thanksgiving break anyway, because we just have 2 weeks. And so once I kind of changed up the class on, you know, just because of just concern for safety and to give them other options, yeah, I dropped down to about 20%, where I'd be happy if it's 70%, you know, and if nothing bad was going on, right? You know, this time of year, that is, yeah.
And Debbie, I promise we're going to get to you, but the professor is where this all happened. So I just want to get a little more from him. Can you tell us where you were when you first heard of these murders, what your initial reaction was?
Yeah, that was so it was Sunday. You know, we're kind of a big football community, and our football team, they played the night before, and Sundays usually when I get caught up on grading, and we have we call it Vandal Alert. We're the Idaho Vandals, and I just got an alert on my phone and on my email that to stay away from this area, shelter in place. And I thought, oh no, I mean, it's it's concerning when we get one. I mean, sometimes they'll send one out because there's a moose on campus or something. Stay away from the moose. And but we see these away, and we were very mindful of them. Of course, I was in my home, and so I didn't think too much of it at the moment, and I just thought, oh my gosh, something horrible had happened. But I did not to the extent that, because it said homicide, and on King Street, and that's all it said. And then I think about 3 hours later, it said coast is clear, and just sort of started to wait and see as we kind of heard some of the details kind of slowly come out. Yeah.
And how surreal is it that you're a professor of criminology, that you teach criminology and even deviant behavior, and suddenly 4 students at the university are slaughtered in the most evil of ways? How surreal is that?
Yeah, that's, I mean, I don't, my pitch to the class used to be here, come to one of the safest communities in the country, where, some of the, you read our police blotter. Yeah, I mean, we have things with college towns with drinking, and I mean, we certainly have issues with minor issues with drugs, and, we'll have an occasional breaking and entering kind of thing. But basically, it's just statistically one of the safest college communities you can come to. And then we learn about some of these, grisly crimes that happen in other places, that we talk about things like what we call in criminology ordinary homicides, never thinking that the extraordinary type that we see here is what's going on. So it's it's really been cause for pause and reflection, and here I've always been able to teach about these really awful topics, but from the vantage point of a really, really safe place.
And did you know or teach any of the 4 victims?
I don't really talk about students, but I will say I didn't directly know any of these students. Yeah.
Okay. And Dr. Goodman, is it okay if I call you Debbie or Doctor?
Of course, either way, I'm good with whatever, but thank you, Joe.
Yeah, so I'm curious, you're a criminologist as well. Your perspective when you found out about this murder case, we're coming up on 4 weeks. Tomorrow will be 4 weeks because this will be airing on Saturday. What was your reaction to hearing about such a gruesome quadruple homicide?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Joel and Carmela, for the honor to join you, and certainly Dr. Wolf, and I too would like to express my condolences anytime I'm asked to participate in a conversation. It's not without emotion. There's definitely the anguish that certainly is widespread, not just in Idaho directly, and I'm here in Florida. So if I may also just take a moment to express my condolences as well to the families of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan. When we first heard about it in Florida, and again, I'm the director here of our program at St. Thomas University. Our students are so deeply devoted to our field, and we always start with the first 15 minutes of class looking at the national crime headlines. And when we all heard about it here, it was just absolute shock and dismay and despair, because we are learning, the students are learning and having an understanding of what this really is. And the magnitude of this case, I feel, as a criminologist, where we have 4 young decedents, and for the viewers, Joel, we do classify this as a mass murder, 3, 4 or more at one location, versus some of these other crime categories of which we speak about too. Serial murder, which is still 3, 4, but at different times, different locations. We're first coming out of almost a 5-year tragedy here in Florida, dealing with a school-based shooter. I don't like to say the name, by the way, if that's okay, because I feel that in many circumstances, these murderers are interested in a spotlight, in a moment of fame in their distorted minds. So I prefer not to even address these individuals by name, but we just brought that case to closure, 17 victims at a school. So when we start now, for me, it's like an onion, Joel and Dr. Wolf, Carmela, who's joining us, of course. Right. But here are the levels and layers of this for me. Here we are, as you suggest, almost at the 1 month mark. We're at the point of ruling out and ruling in. So who thus far has our law enforcement officials ruled out? The boyfriend, the driver, the roommates themselves, the individuals who are reacting and interacting with some of our victims preceding this atrocity, those who were at the food truck. So now a pivotal question becomes, who do we rule in? And therein lies really the deep dive. I think we're going to see some answers within the social media world. These are young people, they're all 20, 21, who are very involved in social media, as most of that age group would be. Whatever college and university, that 18 to 24-year age group is very engaged, right? With Twitter and TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram. So as we look at the victimology patterns, we rule out, we rule in. And this inner circle that we just mentioned here, they've been ruled out. So now who's the next circle to potentially take a look at here? Well, that could be what I think would be these associates, not so much friends, not family, but people that our victims may know of. And I think that's where we may want to take a look next.
And I want to get into some of the particulars, but first, some of the latest news on this case. And back to you, Dr. Wolf. Graduation is this weekend, the winter graduation. What's the atmosphere like on campus? I actually hear from a few friends who are reporting out there that the hotels are actually fully booked. But what is the mood right now ahead of this graduation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Obviously, our winter graduation is not as large as our kind of traditional end of spring graduation, but yeah, the hotels are booked. The it would be really hard to get a seat at a restaurant in town because of that. And so in that sense, there is, life goes on in that sense. And so parents come from, far away and they probably book their hotels, maybe even months ago, but there is in town, finally, there's a sense of fullness. At the same time, I can look out my window out on campus and it's a beautiful, crisp, snowy day, but there's just not a lot of students walking around out there.
And I assume that you go to these restaurants or you go to these hotels and there's one thing people are talking about, which is this quadruple homicide, right? I assume that's what everyone is speaking of.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where you go. I mean, I'll be frank. I'm in the older group, and I actually do. I have gone to the Corner Club is actually, that's one of my favorite places to go. You won't catch me in there after 8 p.m. or after the Sunday football games are over. But that is one place that nobody wants to talk about it. Like that is that of course is where Kaylee and Maddie were the just a few hours before they died. But
what is that bar like? Take us inside there. What kind of place is it?
It's just a wonderful, people call it dive bar. I mean, if you want a fancy martini or something, it's probably not the place for you, but it's there's sports memorabilia all over the walls from the Idaho Vandals. They used to have these glory days in the 1990s and 80s of being a powerhouse football team, and we're coming back. But it's dedicated to that. The bartenders. It's just like I say, I'm old. I'll go there. I'll go in there for a trivia night or something. You'd never see me in there past 8 p.m. But it's pretty off limits. It's not explicitly said, but no, let's talk about anything except the murders. Again, by the same token, outsiders or people visiting or parents that are coming, yeah, they all want to talk about it. Of course they do.
I grew up a stone's throw from Rutgers University, New Jersey, and I used to hang out at those dive bars when I was in high school. My mom, she didn't know till a little while ago. So some more interesting and kind of compelling news, and Dr. Goodman and Dr. Wolf, I'd like to get your take. So authorities, after a lot of days of extreme silence, came out 2 days ago, which will be 3 days when this airs, and say that they are looking for white Hyundai Elantra between the years of a make between 2011 and 2013. The direct quote is, investigators believe the occupant or occupants of this vehicle may have critical information to share regarding this case. To you, Dr. Goodman, what do you make of this?
Right. Well, I think that a vehicle is very important at any crime scene. Obviously, the more we can examine this vehicle, the more we can potentially solve this case and put somebody in handcuffs. So for me, Joel, I'm very interested in the demography of this car. And I like research and data analytics and statistics. That's part of what I do. So even taking a look here at this type of car, and I did a little research on this, what's interesting is that the price point, if it's going to be somewhere in that 2011 to 2013 range, if one were to purchase it presently, it's at or near valued at $15,000. Now, also we know about this vehicle, it's catered more to a male demographic than a female. The piece, however, that's a little bit broad, that doesn't necessarily narrow, let's say, the driver of the vehicle or an owner of a vehicle. Let's say we're comparing and contrasting a Tesla or a Range Rover or a truck, an F-150. We get perhaps another type of demography, but here the age range of who drives this vehicle is pretty far reaching. From what I looked at today, it's at or near early 20s up to mid 60s. So that's a little bit far reaching, I think, as far as the age, but certainly a vehicle is going to be critical if it is this vehicle, because remember, we had another thought about a vehicle, and that was a black SUV. Police didn't really say too much about that, but there was a point in time where that was being looked at as well. But I feel certainly very strongly that what could be the contents of the vehicle, and obviously I'm referring to forensics and any prints or blood, these types of identifiers would be huge.
And to you, Brian, was there maybe a sense of relief that finally investigators were putting out some information that they were seeking to get when you heard about this Hyundai Elantra?
Yeah, I mean, I think to approach that kind of as a community member of the university, to hear that police were asking for information for the public, that seemed to the public like maybe there's been some break in the case or something like that. But I'm afraid I'm gonna have to put on my my professor hat, my analyst hat, and I don't see it kind of with that optimism. What I see it is I can tell you right now, I know you can look around this town, this Hyundai, I'm not going to say nobody in town drives a Hyundai, but it's we're Fords and Subarus and maybe occasional Priuses around here. It's you'd have to drive about 90 miles to find a Hyundai dealer. I guess what I'm trying to say is we're a small community. We've maybe got 15,000 cars registered in this town at the most. I'm going to tell you, I'm just sort of guessing, you've maybe got 40 Hyundais in town or registered with campus parking that fit that description. The fact that, of course, police would have been able to go through and see everything, if there was somebody local fitting that description. What it's telling me now is they're probably looking at somebody who's not from town anymore, which, and that gives me a little bit of concern, actually.
Moscow is a small community of about 26,000 people. Brian, when you go to sleep these days, are you afraid at night? Are you keeping a weapon nearby, or what's your response to this in terms of your own personal safety in the evening?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure. I mean, it's kind of this, just to give you, if I can give you some background real quick about what this town is like. It's, people say, oh, so-and-so's 2 miles away. I mean, pretty much 2 miles from that grub truck in any direction is a wheat field. So at the same time, the town is divided. Highway 95 bisects the town. It's a north-south highway. People like me, where the professors live, is kind of that's to the east of that highway, and then pretty much everything to the west of that highway is kind of campus student-oriented type stuff. And so there's a different feel. I mean, it's whereas where the professors, the townies are living, and neighborhoods and all that. The students are living in densely packed housing and that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, have I taken, extra precautions to, I guess harden my house? Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you that. I'm a criminologist, so I've already had, there's measures in place. I mean, yeah, I mean, things have changed. I do have a keyed lock or a coded lock, and sometimes tradespeople have been in it. I just kind of give it, and I change the codes on the lock, right? And so there's definitely things that I have done personally. As far as for me and my family, I mean, it's just we still feel like, I guess statistically, I'm thinking that this person is long gone, that this person isn't in the community anymore. Whether they were part of it to begin with, I don't know, but yeah, I mean, it makes you. It definitely. We are the kind of place where we leave stuff out, doors unlocked, cars unlocked. That's not happening in this town right now.
It has to be eerie once the sun sets. To you, Dr. Goodman. So we had an amazing panel like yourselves yesterday. We had, and people who haven't heard it should check it out. We had a woman named Ann Burgess. She's an absolute legend. The Netflix show Mindhunters is loosely based around some of her work. She's 86 years old. I don't think she'd mind me saying that. And she's sharp as a tack. And she was on with a gentleman named Gary Bricado, who's a Ph.D. and studies serial killers. And they were discussing the difference between the use of a knife and a gun. And Dr. Goodman, I know you wanted to discuss that a little bit. Can you talk about the distinction? And I'll tell you in 3 words, basically what Dr. Bricado says is in the research that they've done, and they do scientific research on this, they keep data. Anyone who is not using a gun is probably someone who is off kind of the scale of a normal, for lack of a better phrase. Someone who might exhibit odd behavior, someone who may be distant, deviant, all of these things. But if you can explain in your own expertise the difference between the use of a knife and a gun in committing a crime.
Certainly. Well, and again, I know those names very well. They're excellent contributors to our field of crime law and justice. So I'll be very intrigued to watch that episode as well. So I certainly can, I also teach serial and mass murder and these types of crimes that really are very much impacting our community today. If we just take a look statistically at what's happened in our last 3 calendar years, Joel, 2020, 2021, and now tail end of 2022, the uptick in mass shootings, mass murders, these 3 calendar years are really just beyond what we know to be statistically within any kind of normal range, although these crimes obviously are of the abnormal. But when we talk about a murder, whether it's a singular individual, a double homicide, a mass murder, a mass shooting, school-based, workplace, these types of crimes, they're all different. Yet what I look for as a criminologist is some type of thread. So in the analysis of an individual who's using a knife, usually there is some type of, again, knowing between victim and murderer. So it could potentially be, like we said at the onset, somebody who's associated with one or more of these victims. Now, just think of the logistics also, the difference of a knife used to kill an individual. That murderer has to truly be within close proximity to that victim. The gun, of course, one can be farther away. We've seen so many heinous crimes in our history, some of whom are using the gun to shoot out a window of a hotel. I'm talking about the Las Vegas shooting. Others are going into nightclubs and they're shooting based upon hate of the occupants. So these individuals generally don't care about that individual being somebody they know. It's usually just they want a massive amount of fatality. But when we take a look here, and also what police believe to be, They don't know with certainty, but they believe it's in that realm of a K-bar knife. That is a very tactical type of weapon, which is why, as a criminologist, I'm also thinking, as we're moving forward here, back to the ruling out and ruling in, that this could indeed be somebody who has experience with hunting using a type of knife in that regard. But when we have the murderer with hands on the individual, with a knife, with strangulation, with drowning, there is a higher probability of a knowing between victim and murderer.
Anything you want to add to that, Dr. Wolf, about the distinction between knife and gun?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Debbie said, it's the indication of something very close and personal. And I mean, but with the 4 victims, it just makes it baffling to kind of what typical profiling would do, right? I mean, you would maybe think maybe 1 or 2 people, but now we've got 4. I mean, that just makes it baffling in terms of, yeah.
It's important to point out, I think, too, the demographics. So Idaho, obviously, a lot more people are carrying hunting knives than they are in South Florida, let's say, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that wouldn't be unusual to see, you know, somebody having that type of knife on their person for hunting, or just to find an old one in the garage, or I mean, that's yeah, I mean, that would not be unusual around here. Yeah.
And Dr. Goodman, just your hunch, do you think that this person has killed before, whoever this person is?
Well, I think because we'll say he, I believe it's male rather than female. I believe because of the knife that there's experience in the hunting aspect. Now, has he killed a human? I don't necessarily think so. What I do think is that this association, and if we go with the potential, and now I think moving into that next circle of who we're looking at or for, I think this could be an individual who had some kind of fantasy about one of our victims, maybe more than one, as we know in our field, and back to deviant behavior and what we call mens rea actus reus. The mens rea is really the criminal mind. That's how we interpret that. Somebody who has an interest, a desire in committing a crime. And then we don't necessarily know what's in somebody's head and what they're thinking about until they actually participate in the murder. That's the next piece. That's our actus reus. So I think that this individual has created a fantasy homicide type of thinking, that he's been fantasizing about one of the victims, and it may have been on the social media platform. And we don't know. This is just speculation, obviously. Law enforcement officials, we go with their lead, but local, state, and federal, they haven't said it yet, but we know that we have at least 100 plus officers and investigators and agents on this case. We have experts in the field of digital investigation, and they are the ones who look through the phones, the computers, all of the social media. And I think this individual is somebody who became fascinated, but in that deviant way of fantasy that then became homicide. And why? Because then it's like what happened to John Lennon. You know, we have Mark David Chapman, who was just enamored first, as fans can be. But I feel, as a criminologist, there can be that fine line between fan and fanatic, because once somebody kills somebody, they're forever attached and associated.
Very, very interesting. Brian, prior to the murders, we've heard a lot of stories that popped up suddenly. One of them was about a dog that was skinned. Did that raise your antenna at all?
To me, it just sort of seemed like, because I didn't have all the details, and I still don't have all the details, that either that was a separate event. Sometimes people call in, like I said, they think their animal's been deliberately mauled, and it's a coyote. But you know, people say, well, this happened less than 3 miles from the crime scene. That's the whole town is less than 3 miles from the crime scene. So I actually don't really care to speculate, but I would tend to say that this may be something else entirely, especially because I don't think it was followed up on very well by law enforcement to actually verify that it was skinned. But maybe.
And again, to you, Brian, has there been frustration? It's going to be 4 weeks. You know, people expect this to be a CSI episode and be solved. Is there frustration on that end? And also in the messaging the police have had in terms of targeting, not targeting, target attack, not a target attack. But first, just in the terms of 4 weeks in, were people hoping this would be solved already?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, of course. I mean, first of all, to take your first question about messaging, that had everybody upset. And so the first messaging was that, there's not a threat to the community, then there may be a threat to the community. Then the police were holding pressers that really didn't give much new. And that has given a lot of frustration that the police weren't consistent in their messaging. Our local politicians, our prosecutors were giving national news media interviews that seemed to indicate they knew something, but then they walked it back. I mean, so there's been a pretty big communication problem here, and I think that leads to frustration in the communities, and rightly so, and as well as the families. I will say, if I can add to that, though, I will say that, Chief Fry, I do know him, and I've had a few of my former students actually work for the Moscow Police Department. The idea that, yeah, we're small, but the idea that these are a bunch of country bumpkins that don't know what they're doing is, I mean, I would push back on that a little bit. A lot of these officers, they've worked in bigger cities, and they've decided to come here for quality of life issues, that kind of thing. Chief Fry, he's been one of those 1% of the officers that have received that special law enforcement training at Quantico. And he, just did that a couple years ago. Maybe he's not the most media savvy person. I don't think he's had to deal with that before. And so while there were missteps, I think we also need to at least give some benefit of the doubt to the law enforcement in terms of how they initially handled it. But yeah, we don't have anything. Everybody's going on rumor and speculation around this town, and that's not helpful, but we want them to get the right person too.
And to your point, I've heard a few New York City former detectives say that, the NYPD is not prepared for a quadruple homicide, let alone, Moscow, Idaho. So I'm sure it's been really challenging for them as well. From an investigative standpoint, this is a party house, and Dr. Goodman, you can address this. This is, allegedly a known party house, a lot of people going in and out. Now you've got 4 victims. How difficult is it to process, the DNA, the blood samples, and collect the evidence?
Right. So very difficult, because there's also the victimology piece of 4 decedents. But I also want to just add my thought too about what Dr. Wolf just said regarding our law enforcement, local, state, and federal, for whom I have an enormity of respect and regard and admiration wherever they may be. We have close to 1 million officers and agents in our country today. And I think these men and women are just so devoted, so dedicated to what they do. It's not just a profession, but it's a passion to ensure that there really is daily safety, security, survival. And a case of this magnitude, Joel, to address your question, it is very intense. And I feel that with all of those who are directly involved, they're doing a tremendous job. Back to your earlier point about this kind of baseline, let's say, of solving a crime in 1 hour or less. Well, again, that's fiction, not fact. Perhaps crimes of this type of magnitude can be solved within hours, within days, when we literally may have a Ring camera pointed by the front door, or we have witnesses in close proximity who can actually give a description of the individual, and or we have the car that the murderer drives away in with a license plate. So this is such an enormous type of case. I think that, again, the investigators are doing very well. There's so much forensics. We've got at least 1,000+ pieces of evidence that they're looking at. The tip lines are very important. You know, this whole community, it's not just the community of Moscow and the state of Idaho, but the whole world is talking about this case with real, you know, concern and care, and wanting this person to be brought to justice. So I really feel that our law enforcement officials, local, state, and federal, are doing a good job.
There are a couple of issues with surveillance footage. First off, Brian, the president of Sigma Chi spoke out, and I know you don't want to talk about students, but basically made it clear that the fraternity house has no surveillance cameras. Are you surprised by that?
I am very surprised by that in this day and age. Those certainly those sorority houses on Greek Road, they all have security cameras, footage. So that I was taken aback by that, actually, that they at least wouldn't have something on that front door. Yeah.
And then just, it so happens, I guess coincidentally, around the time of the killings, police stopped a couple of rowdy students, and they had their body cameras rolling, and you can almost, you see the house in the distance.
Yeah.
To both of you, Debbie first, what are investigators doing right now with that video? Are they enhancing the video? Are they going frame by frame, and what are they looking for?
Absolutely, looking for any thread, because to the world, something may seem very minuscule, irrelevant, but to law enforcement, it's all about threading. It's threading these details together. You know, I was even researching this morning about a gentleman who's now coming forward. Apparently, he's a neighbor in close proximity to this home, the home of the victimization, and he's a chef. And he comes home more in the later part of the evening, early morning. So he's now coming forward to say that he heard a scream that he thought was at or near 4 a.m. But he's first reporting it almost now moving into week 4, because he thought it was not significant or irrelevant. But this is where I think the real ask is of the community to report whatever it might be. Let law enforcement figure out and thread these details. That is going to lead to a conviction of this individual.
And I'm glad you brought that up. That report is the most recent report of them all. And one of the things that people were intrigued by is that no one heard any screaming with 4 victims. And there are, you know, a lot of takes out there as to why that was the case. I spoke to a Navy SEAL who says it's very, very easy to very quickly incapacitate a person. That was one of the theories. It was all done very quickly. But now it's interesting, 4 weeks later, we're getting this, you know, eyewitness account allegedly. One of the things that a person from Boise, whose husband actually lived in that same house 25 years ago as a law student, one of the things they brought up, Brian, is that there are a decent amount of students who are of the Mormon faith at one point, and, you know, drinking is prohibited. And so maybe some students would be reluctant or reticent to speak because they were maybe out drinking at a party when it goes against their religion. Any comments on that?
No, I mean, I know that there's talk of Idaho being, you know, we do have a heavily, you know, LDS presence, but, you know, first up here, yeah, I mean, we've got Mormons, we've got Catholics, we've got Jews, we've got atheists. So, you know, I think that there are absolutely LDS students up here, but I mean, their faith teaches that, yeah, I mean, you don't drink alcohol, but if you drink alcohol, and I mean, I think that it would be part of their culture to come forward and say, look, I was out doing this and I saw that, or, you know, maybe I was doing something that the church teaches against, but this, I mean, I think that is part of the honesty part of that. And I don't know much about that particular faith, but you know, I think that person probably has overstated how much Latter-day Saint influence is up here. They definitely are. And the ones that are very ardent tend to seek, you know, either living situations, communities that support that. And we have private Latter-day Saint colleges in Idaho that they tend to go to. Of course, everybody's welcome here, but I think that maybe overstates a little bit that possibility anyway.
And Dr. Goodman, you kind of alluded to this. I want to dig a little bit deeper if you guys both put on your criminologist hats. And I talked about this with former law enforcement, Ann Burgess, who's this legendary figure. But do you see this as a crime of rage or a thrill crime, which would, you know, indicate more of a serial killer? What is your what's your gut telling you?
Sure. So I've been asked that question by many journalists thus far, Joel, reporters. I do not think, based on what we know thus far, that this is the action and the criminal conduct of a serial killer. And that's because of the knife. I really feel that this is somebody who has some knowledge of one or more of these victims. Clearly, it's a crime of rage, as serial killers and or mass murderers will get that type of you know, demonstration of quality, character, demeanor. But we also want to be clear that for many of these killers, once again, whether it's a singular killer, double homicide, mass murder, and so forth, there is some level of thrill for them. Again, that's the deviant mind. It's hard for those of us, all of us, to understand, when we're logical individuals, when we're reasonable individuals, how and why people are thrilled, get excited. We also call it hedonistic killings, where people will receive pleasure from the act. And here's why. Here's how I would analyze that as a criminologist, because there is absolute and complete domination of another human being. There is degradation, there's humiliation, power, control. This individual, whether he's a singular murderer, double, triple, and beyond, they're in control, and they like to be that.
And Dr. Wolf, strictly speaking, as a criminologist now, what's your take on the profile of this killer?
Yeah, I like I said, I've hedged only a little bit because they're looking to the public to find a car that they should be able to find locally. But I'm still kind of going with, you know, I tell my students about the science of criminology, and then there's kind of an art to criminology, and the art is piecing the science together. Just given how this, I'm still going with somebody is acquainted with at least one of the victims. That's still what I'm thinking. I think that the surviving two roommates below, that's really telling to me regarding the profile of a murderer, and the police's original take that this was somehow targeted. So I'm still leaning towards somebody acquainted, whether this is revenge or some other power control issue. I'll leave that up to a different set of experts. So,
and as a broadcast journalist for a quarter of a century, that's what I did. I'd like to say I have knowledge a mile wide, but only an inch deep. You guys go super deep when it comes to, you know, reporters swoop in and swoop out. We have to be experts on a subject, and it changes from day to day. But you guys really like drill down on this. I'm curious, Dr. Wolf, why did you get interested in criminology?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I mean, it's you know, I think, you know, you grow up and you learn some just basic things. There's heroes and there's villains, and then you get a little bit older, and you know, I won't get too personal, but you know, you push against rules and norms, and as a teenager, and then you kind of just want to know, well, why do people do bizarre things? Why do people do strange things? I got into it like, why would people join a nudist colony, or you know, become a Satan worshiper, or you know, kind of more of those questions. So, but then we get into like people just I think in criminology, criminal justice, you see the best in human potential, and you see the absolute worst in human potential. I think you see both of those two things, and I think understanding that is endlessly fascinating to me.
For full disclosure, I'm the son of a retired psychiatrist, and my mother is a licensed therapist. So I'm really intrigued by the mind, this deviant mind, and how it goes south seemingly very quickly. But same question to you, Dr. Goodman. What got you interested in all this?
Well, thank you. And that is a great question. I'm born and raised here in Florida. So I did all my studies at Florida schools. And when I went to FSU, I didn't realize that FSU was just a major criminology, criminal justice university. And so as I was doing my studies, and I was interested then and now in a lot of topics, Joel, to include crime, law, justice, communication, psychology. And when I took my first criminology class, I was absolutely intrigued. So I took that as, an 18-year-old freshman, not realizing that that was going to be my pathway. And I was always somebody who arrived very early to everything then and now. And just a quick story about how I got to be a professor was one of my professors had an emergency. It was a 9 o'clock class. I'm there at 7:30. He goes into the lobby area. Debbie, can you do me a huge favor? Of course, Professor, what could that be? Well, I've got to go and I've got a family emergency. These classes were with 200, 300 students. Can you teach my class? So here I am, 18 years old, and I had about an hour and a half to prepare in front of 200 of my colleagues, but I quickly, put something together. And then I just thought after the class session, you know what, I'll have the students just anonymously evaluate me. So they did that. I gave it to the professor, whatever. A couple of days later, he goes, you know what, I want you to be my teaching assistant. The class was so thrilled with how you conducted everything. And that's actually how it all started for me. This love of crime, law, and justice. My professor gave me an opportunity, and here we are, a couple of decades in, and I love it. And the real love, Joel, for me is platforms like yours are so far reaching and so important, because as Dr. Wolf and I know, we could be in our classroom with 50 to 100 students, 25, 50, 100, whatever it might be. But when we do a platform like this, we're still teaching and training the community about the field. But what I'm so passionate about too is about the safety, the security, and the survival, making sure people will not be victimized with crime.
One of the interesting things that came up with Ann Burgess and Dr. Bricado, he talked about how crimes have become increasingly more violent since the 60s. Dr. Wolf, to you, how is our landscape? I mean, obviously technology's here. We've got Instagram. People are, seeing what they imagine to be these perfect lives. We've got this terminology now about incels, basically these involuntary celibates. How has the landscape changed to potentially make crimes worse now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like on one hand, it's people who it's gotten a lot harder to remain anonymous. That's for sure. I think as these technologies were rolling out, I mean, we were actually seeing crime rates come down in the 2000s and 2010s, and now all of a sudden it's gotten up. I mean, I can't speak to like if but we definitely have had more mass shootings than we've had before, and those types of things, but. I don't know. I mean, I think obviously incels. I mean, that wasn't a term we had when I was in college, and they've found a community online, right? And they found a place to, express their not insecurity but rage, or they've got all their language they use to describe women that they're very misogynistic towards, and so people can find communities where they can express misogyny, and then in those subgroups that seems like an acceptable thing, and I think that maybe gives people at least a way to incubate these types of feelings. So yeah.
And Dr. Goodman, I know you wanted to discuss victimology. Can you tell the audience what is it and why is it important to know about it? And then we'll sort of wrap up this portion and take some, the audience is what makes Surviving the Survivor what it is. So I'd like to take some viewer comments, but victimology.
Yes, absolutely. So for me, Joel, as a criminologist, victimology, criminology, psychology, sociology, there's a lot of, again, I like to use the terminology threading. There's interrelationships among these entities. But when it comes to victimology, there's three levels or layers, if you will: primary, secondary, tertiary. Primary, of course, is, and back to our direct case and tragedy, the recipient of the crime itself. So our four decedents, they are considered the primary victims. However, it doesn't stop or end there. We keep going to that secondary layer. Secondary layer of victimization really speaks to the inner circle of the primary victim. So who are those individuals? Certainly now in the Idaho case would be the parents, the direct siblings, the extended family members, closest friends, because they too are feeling the enormity and just so devastated and distraught as to what's happened with their loved one. And then tertiary would be the rest of the citizens and society. We are still very caring, concerned individuals. When we hear about such an atrocity that has taken place, we can all relate in some way or another, whether being a parent or being somebody who interacts with the workplace. At some level, the whole world is impacted by this case, and victimology is very far-reaching.
And Brian, Dr. Wolf,
Yeah.
It's a broad question, but where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously we're going to have a lot of patience in this particular case. It always, I think college students, they just, they need to learn to take a few security precautions. And, I think, locking doors, landlords need to get rid of those sliding doors. Those are too easy to defeat. But yeah, this community has a lot of healing to do, and it has, and that's sort of maybe less broad, but that's, that's, who knows where this is going. I think this case is kind of starting to get cold. I'd call it lukewarm right now. But I'm still really
that was a follow-up question. When does this case become cold? I've gotten so many varying opinions. I've talked to former law enforcement who say, like you said, it's beginning to become cold right now, and others who say this case won't be a cold case for 2 more years because of the high profile nature. But you believe it's becoming a little lukewarm right now?
Well, I think they're starting to wind things down. I mean, they've, probably done a lot of interviews, and, they kind of get to a point where they're maybe waiting on things or following up other things. But yeah, I mean, to me, I mean, with the recent Moscow Police Department press release, I did see kind of what was a reduction in numbers devoted to this case. I don't, on one hand, I'm not, that's not too concerning, but we are getting, with a killer who already had a 9-hour head start on law enforcement. Here we are, we're coming up on the month, and while I trust that they have they're following leads and probably new evidence is coming in. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, as far as defining the cold case, I don't know. I'm gonna just vote on, I'm gonna kind of cut it in the middle and just say I think it's be lukewarm for a while.
And Dr. Goodman, same question to you. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of hope and faith and confidence in our law enforcement representatives. That's certainly how I feel. I've been involved in hundreds of cases through the years, review, analysis, commentary, working with and knowing and understanding our local, state, and federal officers and agents' mentality, that they are, as we speak, eating, breathing, sleeping this case, meaning it is all consuming, all encompassing. My belief is that they're not giving up until somebody is in handcuffs. And when somebody's in handcuffs, the whole world is going to know about it and feel a sense of relief. But where do we go from here? I think it's also, Joel, a call for action again daily among those direct citizens of the state, and also certainly of the city and county, that any little thing that they think is a little thing should still be reported, whether it's regarding this case and what's happened from November 13th to the present. Let law enforcement officials dissect it, discern it, and then make the decision. I'm all about safety and security. What's been mentioned here is the target hardening. Yes, that's going to be very important with the locking of the doors, even if that's not necessarily what the community is all about. Those doors have to be locked, well lit neighborhoods, see something, say something, anything of any minor to mild to major irregularity, that should be reported. That's why we have our men and women of our crime, law, and justice field.
And if it's okay with you, we'll turn to some viewer questions and comments and get the criminologist take. And I realize Dr. Wolf is very close to the university. So if there's something that you're not comfortable with, Brian, I totally get it. First one with an appropriate name. And this goes to the point that everyone out there, many people try to be cyber sleuths. Cabin Fever writes, I feel like everyone in that house was targeted. Perp got in through back window or sliding door, goes straight up to third floor. Either Maddie or Kaylee was able to let out a short scream. That scream woke up Ethan, and he left the bedroom to see what was going on. Perp came down to second floor and came face to face with Ethan. Ethan turned and tried to get back in the bedroom, locked the door, but he didn't get the door closed, and Perp attacked him. Xana was then awakened by their struggle and was able to fight for her life when Perp attacked her, and it goes on and on and on. Brian, we don't really know what happened, right?
No, we don't. We know that there were 4 people in that house that died by a stabbing. That's factually all we know. We don't know the order. We don't know any of that. We have to stay with facts. So, yeah.
And Dr. Goodman, to you, what about this need to solve the crime? You know, people out there want to solve the case, a lot of them just themselves. Where does this need arise from?
Well, I think because of the connectivity, Joel. Again, I'm in Miami, you're in Miami. This is an Idaho case. We've got people around the globe talking about this case. It has some way, somehow impacted individuals throughout the United States. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing when people are talking about it, trying to help, trying to assist. Now, again, as we sit here potentially 1 month into the case, we can only go with the facts. See, that part I agree with too. And ultimately, it will be the facts that will lead us to the individual in handcuffs moving through the criminal justice system. But I do go back to those individuals who would have some shred of knowledge. Again, they think it's mild, it could be medium, it could be major. Just report it. Let investigators decide.
Next comment comes from Leslie4690. This was fantastic, talking about our most recent episode. I too believe he had been, this is the killer, at the house for parties and was once considered loosely in their inner circle. The reason I keep circling back by instinct to Jack S., that's the man in the so-called white hoodie. And there's a lot of talk that his parents are both doctors, he's privileged, that he's even maybe in Africa. I don't think any of that has been corroborated. I think the fact that they're doctors has, but the fact that he's in Africa, maybe not. But this person says, the reason I keep circling back by instinct to Jack is because he was the last one seen with the girls, and his behavior was predatory and angry, and he had recently been pushed to the outside of that social group when his anger eruptions got him kicked out of the fraternity. Maddie's boyfriend was in, and then the main college bar. I think he felt entitled to be a part of it and was raging. Let's start with Debbie on this one. Again, it's a speculative comment, but anything to it?
Right. I'm not disagreeing with commentary, because I think at this point, Joel, anything is possible for our citizens to be utilizing their logical reasoning, then yes, it's something to potentially consider. But ultimately, as we sit here, nobody knows directly, even the panelists, right? We're all speculating, but we are doing so as well in a framework of our own knowledge, experience, history, data analytics. So I trust our law enforcement officials, local, state, and federal. I think we will have somebody who will be attributed to this crime, and I trust our process.
Next comment is from the great interpreter. I could be wrong, but many times we discover that the killer was in plain sight the whole time. We look back and say, of course, how could we think it was anyone else? Moreover, these killers often make that one crucial mistake that blows their cover and proves they had motive and access. You agree with that, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, that's how we catch people. Murderers make mistakes, and I suspect there were, like, from a murderer's point of view, there were mistakes made in this, and yeah, I mean, I think that's how I'm thinking of Scott Peterson giving his public remarks, referring to his wife in the past tense when they were still looking. I mean, people. Yeah, I mean, that's one way that's how we get them: inconsistencies, slip ups, that kind of thing. Yeah.
And to you, Dr. Goodman?
Yeah, we actually have a theory on that in criminology. Criminology is all about theories, and a lot of times theories are equated to reality once we know with certainty. And that theory is actually called thanatos, meaning at a subconscious level, individuals will say things, or they will have evidence that points back to them. It's like an individual, let's say, who's involved in a DUI. Oh, of course, officer, there was no drinking involved. And then right there is the open bottle, you see? So yeah, it's not that uncommon.
Humans make mistakes, right? This next person covers all the bases with their name, Sir Madam. My intuition tells me this murderer is highly sensory, is good at mechanics and engineering, and wore a headlight. These lights are often owned by dog owners for walking dogs. I also feel he's an introvert. Brian?
I can't comment on much. Joggers wear those headlights around here. I've got one of those headlights in my drawer because it's pretty dark in the mornings around here and in the evenings this time of year. So introvert. Yeah, it's always the quiet guy. I can't comment really on that. Yeah.
And Dr. Goodman, a similar comment. So let me get your take on this. This comes from Dappy Hayes. Yes, I've said this from the start. I believe this is somebody who feels rejected by society or feels rejected by this particular group of people. I've also said that right now he or she is probably watching their P's and Q's. However, if this turns into a cold case, I think their ego is inflated to where they'll be able to strike again, maybe not in Idaho. Overall, it's horrifying to think about this turning into a cold case. 4 victims who deserve justice. I know law enforcement is doing everything that they can. Dr. Goodman, I want to get your response, but is there any chance this killer, in your opinion, was a female?
I'm going to pretty strongly say I don't think so. We've had female, and again, I don't like to use the name, but since you're asking me directly about a mass murder type of situation or serial murderer, we've had some here, even in Florida. Eileen Vornos, she is one who's been recognized as a female serial killer. She was executed. But statistically, Joel, and that's what I do as a criminologist, I look at the statistics, the data analytics, the history, that mass murderers and mass shooters, although again, it's not a shooting, but tend to be male.
And Charlize Theron, I believe, won an Oscar for that movie, for Monster, where she portrayed our Eileen Wuornos. But what about the fact that they say this person, this killer, feels rejected by society or feels rejected by this particular group of people, Dr. Goodman? Sure.
That piece, I think, it can be a valid submission from the viewer. I definitely, we do have the data analytics on that these people, I call them, Joel, throughout many parts of their lives and lifestyles and lifetimes, feel invisible, feel on the outside rather than the inside. And once they start to plan this, and let's again go back to that, I totally don't think this was any kind of an instantaneous decision. This was something planned, and we go right back down the line of what first degree murder is, and times 4 in this atrocity, but it was planned, premeditated, it was willful, it was with malice. So yes, I do think that there's a high probability that this person is somebody on the outskirts of mainstream society and does something of this magnitude, who can then feel as if the spotlight is now on him.
This next comment is a similar comment with a little bit of a twist. It comes from user and a million letters afterwards. I'll spare you that. This person writes, most believe based on limited release information, this was someone from their inner to mid circle, probably someone who was rejected. The person is probably familiar with the house and he has been there before. This is the interesting part. Kaylee was no longer living there and on her way out of state to a new job. So if it was her the perp was looking at, it may have been a small window of opportunity to get her. Is that, Brian? I mean, again, we're speculating, but is that a potential motive?
Yeah, I guess it's one of many potential motives. I understand that is actually that is true, and that has been released, that she had moved out of there. She was just in town for the weekend, and that she was preparing to move on with her life. She was pretty much done with classes, and so that is one of many motives that I see out there. Yeah.
This one comes from Briar Rose. She gives a time code of our last episode and says, this is exactly what I've been saying. We as a society have abandoned right versus wrong, and made everything a gray area. The erasure of social structure, religion, moral code, etc., is why our country is suffering so much. Debbie, does this person make a good point?
I think so, but I think when we, back to your terminology earlier, Joel, with the deep dive, there's so many things that individuals who murder at a level that we're talking about, mass murder, serial murder, they tend to dismiss thoughts and norms and mores and values of mainstream society. At some point, they make their own decisions about how they want to proceed, what they want to do. They're able to justify it first in their minds as to why it appears to be what they will do, and then they go ahead and do it. There is a dismissal, yes, I agree with the viewer, of mainstream adherence to laws, policy, procedure, protocol.
This next one, I'd like to get both your takes with Brian first. The commenter is RBD. Another great show, an amazing panel of guests, referring to the latest episode. Your show never disappoints. Thank you, RBD. I've heard speculation whether the murders were sexually motivated. Given the right personality type and possible erectile dysfunction or problems with climaxing, could the perp identify with his knife as being his sexual organ? This is interesting. Brian, reading too much into it, or is there something to that?
With this specific case, I don't know, but I mean, it would not surprise me were we to catch this person to find out they were, had some kind of sexual inadequacy. They were sexually incompetent. They were impotent. They were, maybe in their sexuality. I mean, they say this crime has no sexual motive, but there is to dominate women with a knife, a bladed object. I mean, that is a power control that could be related in some kind of, latent sexual dysfunction, right? I mean, yes.
And to you, Dr. Goodman, could this knife be the substitute for the phallus of this individual?
Yeah, I think certainly the individual who's commenting on this has definitely background, given some thought as to a theory here. But when we go back to something we said earlier, and that was what the intent of a murderer is with a knife, yes, there's rage, yes, there's hedonism. So when we say hedonism is pleasure, can the individual who kills an individual derive pleasure, and can that pleasure also be of a sexual nature? The answer is yes. even though we know, based on law enforcement revelation, that there was no rape that we know of at this point.
Next comment, I promise we're winding up in just a minute or two. It comes from Teresa, 2803. So thankful I found this stream, one of the best of the best. Thank you, Teresa. I could listen to it all day long. Could have the perpetrator not only had these emotional, mental issues, be an avid hunter? One thought, my husband, that does not follow any of this type of true crime, has commented on this case, being he is a 3-time tour of Iraq, retired military personnel. He has questioned, could the perp be prior military, had some type of military training, suffered with PTSD along with prior mental behavior or just rejection in many phases of his life? Brian, to you on this one, could it be ex-military who's struggling?
I want to throw that to Debbie. I mean, I think that, sure. I mean, I think of people with ex-military, I think of Tim McVeigh, right? Who, that, maybe there's a desensitization there, but other than what I've known in the past, I'd punt on that one, actually. Thanks.
All right, no worries. Debbie, you want to take it?
Sure. So first, let me say that I am, again, so grateful and appreciative to our men and women of military service, law enforcement service. Given the knife and these types of wounds, is it possible? It's possible. But I do want to say this as a criminologist about insanity. See, that's something we really didn't cover, but my own students have asked me that, and I get a lot of emails from, viewers of different platforms asking me, could this person be insane? So to that, I'm going to say no. And here's why. Because in our field of these types of crimes, the percentages and percentiles of individuals legally being declared insane is less than 2%. But if we can just momentarily, Joel, I know we're almost out of time, but just remind the viewers, what does legal insanity mean? It means the individual didn't know what he or she was doing at the time of the crime, and the individual did not know what he or she was doing was wrong. So on something like this, I do not believe the individual was insane. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing is wrong at the moment, at or near 30 days in. He's not in handcuffs, but again, I feel very strongly that he will be soon.
And one final comment, Dr. Wolf, I know, has an engagement, and it's time to wrap things up. This one comes from my favorite name, Easy Condition. These students posted a lot of Instagram posts from around the house, and the stalking, in quotes, could have been done not only through Instagram with a fixation on one of the students, but also through the city, perhaps, by getting floor plans. It would not be hard to imagine what the inside would look like from the videos, plans, and observing the exterior. And they got a trophy, they got the knife, and it ain't cleaned. Brian, to you, is this knife potentially, it hasn't, the weapon has not been found. Is it potentially the killer's trophy?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's probably the number. I mean, yeah, I think that's potentially the case. It's killer's keeping it as a trophy, to the point of, mapping out this house online or on Instagram. Yeah, I mean, there was house plans up on this thing on renter websites and Zillow and that kind of thing. So would have the killer known all the little nuances about the house, like the step between the living room and the kitchen? I mean, that would be something, somebody would maybe want to know about, or but yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of, it's not unusual. College students have a big Instagram profile. Yeah. And presence.
It's made the world better in some ways and made the worst, the world a lot worse in many other ways. I fear for my young kids who are 8, 6, and 3, they're already addicted to those phones. But to you, Dr. Goodman, anything to the fact that this knife could be a trophy?
I think that the viewers are so smart in presenting a lot of this, and I will say yes to that. It is more common than not for the killer to maintain and remain with something. It is like the rest of us in normal thinking and normal society. We go on vacation, we want to get a souvenir because we want to remember, that moment in time. That is true, unfortunately, for these individuals too who murder. And I'll say yes to that comment, that yes, I think the knife for this killer is a symbol of what he's done, and he's proud of what he's done.
And I want to give you each a chance to just comment on anything you would like to say to wrap things up, with Dr. Goodman first, and then Brian. So Dr. Goodman, anything on your mind to close it out?
Well, really, Joel, just to thank you, Carmela, Steve, and just a real honor and privilege to join you and Dr. Wolf. I think
Steve, by the way, is our amazing, phenomenal, legendary producer. I could use more adjectives. He's the one that gets us the best guests in the game by far. I got to say, you guys gave the legend Ann Burgess and Dr. Bricado a run for their money. Dr. Wolf, a final thought or comment from you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate that, the whole eyes of the world are on our little community right now. And, I appreciate media that can pronounce the name of the town right and not call us the University of Ohio. And I just want your listeners to know that this is, it was, and it will continue to be, it is just a great community, and it is a wonderful world-class educational institution. And while we will always keep these victims in our hearts, I also want the world to know that when they do look away from us, because I think the media will eventually go, that this is, we're much more than just these murders. And yeah.
And Dr. Goodman, a big thank you to you, and Dr. Brian Wolf, an immense thank you to you. Just know that our condolences are with the university, with the students, with the victims' families, with you. We hope you guys all stay safe. We hope there's a quick and swift resolution. And I also hope, selfishly, that you'll both come back on my show. Do I have a yes from both of you?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. So once again, it's Dr. Brian Wolf, the current chair of the Department of Criminology at the University of Idaho, and Dr. Debbie Goodman, who's at St. Thomas University, two phenomenal criminologists. Thank you so much. Love you, America.
Thank you, Joe.